Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of In Conversation. And today with me, I have Mr. Arindam Sen, who's partner and GCC Sector Leader for Technology, Media and Entertainment and Telecom at EY India. Hi, Arindam. How are you doing today?
Very good, Anish. Thank you for having me on this chat.
So we have an interesting topic lined up for today, Arindam, and the topic is emerging hubs the next destination of the GCC boom? Is the next GCC boom coming from India's emerging hubs? That's the topic that we will discuss today. But before we get into the topic, why don't you introduce yourself and talk a bit about your current responsibilities and priorities?
Sure, Anish. As you rightly said, I've been with EY India now for about 6 years. My primary role is to lead our GCC business that we do, specifically focusing on the non-financial services side, so everything outside banking and insurance. And at EY, we've been working with the GCC ecosystem for many, many years. And we do primarily two things. One is, of course, help companies set up their GCCs in the country, which is one part of what we do. And the larger part is the business that we do across technology, risk, tax, workforce advisory, business consulting with existing GCCs in the country. And that forms the bulk of our relationships and our business at large from an EY perspective.
Thanks, Arindam. So yeah, like you rightly said, the GCC sector is booming with 1750 plus GCC entities in India, and totally accounting for more than 3,000 units in across regions in India. But leading into the topic, still if we see 65% of them are located in just two cities, which is Bangalore and Hyderabad. If you dig deep further, about 28% are in regions like NCR, Pune, Mumbai, Chennai, right? So a very small 7% is what we see in the emerging hubs. But with the recent focus and the rise of the mid-market GCCs, right? Where the GCCs are probably a 500, 1,000, or even smaller setups, right?
Right.
The way the emerging hubs can be, emerge as the next center of development or growth for GCCs. I think that's an interesting topic to discuss about today. And for that, let me first begin by asking you, in terms of what are the key elements of building an efficient and a sustainable GCC ecosystem in any of the emerging hubs?
Yeah, so I think, look, from an emerging hub perspective, and if you take even mature hubs, the GCC ecosystem is clearly built on probably two to three things. One is infrastructure at large, in terms of the infrastructure that is provided by the government and private players to this GCC ecosystem. The second one is the cost of operations. So how much does it really cost to run business and establish a GCC and sustain it over many, many years? The third most important part is the accessibility to talent. And that accessibility to talent keeps changing year over year, because the requirements for talent and the kind of skill sets you're looking for also changes year over year. Now, as far as emerging hubs are concerned, I think these three things are of paramount importance to be tackled. Now, it is already established and very clear that cost of operations, actually, emerging hubs are probably ahead than mature for obvious reasons, right? They're virtually an untapped market. Their cost, as far as infrastructure is concerned, talent is concerned, is much lower than established markets. So I think that one is not of a concern to many people when they come into the country. But the other two, so specifically the availability of grade A infrastructure, connectivity to the rest of the world, is still assuming a lot of importance in discussions when we have with companies, specifically when we talk about emerging hubs. But, trumping all of this is the talent conversation. Still, when we talk, probably 90% of the companies don't even consider emerging hubs as a viable option because they're very skeptical as to whether they will find the talent that they're looking for. I think it is even more concerning for mid-market companies, and I'll tell you why. It's because mid-market companies, are not that familiar with operations in India, not familiar with the country at large, are probably handheld to a large degree by partners who are helping them do these kind of setups. The third thing is that they don't necessarily have a very large headcount to play with. They're not coming here to establish centers that are going to have 35, 40, 50,000 people. At most, they're going to have between 200, 250, 300, some, very, very rare cases up to 1,000 people. Now, the question that arises is if I'm coming in and I'm going to have a team of 200 people, I'd rather go to a location where I've seen this happen 100 times over, where an ecosystem exists, where I don't have to really stretch to hire that talent. That's probably one of the biggest problems, and that's applicable even for large companies, is they are still very skeptical as to whether we will find the people or not, right? So to me, the reason why emerging hubs have not really exploded today are probably these 2, 3 reasons that are holding them back, which is still very unclear on the table as to what kind of capabilities do these hubs really bring. Now, there are success stories. I'm sure we'll discuss some of that, Anish, as we progress through the conversation. But at large, it's still not there.
No, I totally agree with you, and I think GCC requires a much more mature ecosystem than probably other sectors, IT sectors require, right? In terms of the depth of the talent, in terms of these, the numbers might differ, and like you rightly said, cost, infra, and availability of talent are the three major factors that drive it. So, but the pandemic and post-pandemic, has really changed the game. And I think gone are the days when there were people considering whether it's safe to go to, outside the big metro cities, and also some of those things have been answered on their own. And given the the family culture that we have in India, people coming from different parts of the country and being in these major cities, I think that itself gives us a lot of opportunity. But yes, like you rightly said, we have to work on it. So let me pick up from there and ask you, so infra, like you said, but infra, we only talk about good roads, airport connectivity, digital connectivity, and I think probably on the digital infrastructure, we have done pretty well as a country, as India, right? But what do you think are the other kind of elements that you think is critical to develop or mature an ecosystem, given that, GCC has a tendency to have more lateral hires rather than the pyramid is very different from a typical IT. So what are the other elements you feel is very important for developing an ecosystem in an emerging city?
Look, I think if you look beyond infrastructure and connectivity, it all boils down to talent and accessibility to talent. Now that, to be honest, is easier said than done, because in major cities, if you look, before GCCs came, there were service providers, right? And even today, you have very, very large campuses of the likes of Infosys, Wipro, and TCS in every major city. That's a breeding ground for talent, and talent that GCCs hire also quite significantly. The second part that has emerged more later than before is the startup ecosystem. That's also another breeding ground for talent. Now, when you move to an emerging hub, if neither of these two exist, hiring lateral folks is nearly impossible. And as you rightly pointed out, Anish, I think if you look, especially if a city like Bangalore, for example, 70% of the people working in GCCs are migrant population that have come at some point of time from a tier 2 location anyway, right? So I don't think there is going to be a huge amount of coercion or push required for them to stay back where they originated from, I think they'll do it gladly. The problem, however, is that the training that they've received and the skills that they have received have been uh, inculcated into them through the ecosystem that existed in Bangalore prior to even GCC's arriving, right? And then has steadily matured. Now, when you look at success stories of emerging cities, if you take the likes of Coimbatore, for example, if you take Gift City, which is starting to become quite an interesting proposition, if you take Cochin, at some point, the ecosystem actually started with the likes of the larger service providers setting up bases in these cities, incorporating talent from good educational institutions, training them, and then came the GCCs, which then started to attract some of those. So to me, the bigger part is that it has to have some semblance of an ecosystem before a GCC jumps in. Now, the other part, you quoted 7% of GCCs in emerging cities. Now, if you look even closer to that number, Anish, you will see that they are satellite centers. They're not necessarily the primary location. Most of these GCCs have already established hubs. When the need arose for them to have a satellite hub, they looked at Coimbatore, Kochi, Bhubaneswar, Indore, whatever the case, right? But they're not the primary hub. That's a much easier proposition to sell because you already have an established hub. Now the question is taking those best practices and finding the right city where you want to have a smaller satellite center. And then you've got people that you could potentially transfer from the main hub back, right, into the satellite hub, have a critical mass already there, and then build from there. So there are many different working models, but they are all pointing currently to more of a hub and spoke rather than the primary location.
Yeah, absolutely. Hub and spoke model is what is most prevalent. And I think different stakeholders, and you also alluded to the fact that some of these emerging cities have the presence, large presence
Correct.
from IT services company, consulting companies. How do we leverage that, right? And
Yeah.
another element that we have to take into consideration is that the tech world and the emerging the millennials and beyond millennials workforce that we have,
Yeah.
right, has a fear of obsolescence when it comes to technology, right?
Right.
They believe that it's in the Bangalore and it's the Hyderabad's of the world where the most of the action is happening, and we need to be there to be up to date with the technology, with the skills and all. So I think one of those is also the elements that we have to, like you said, in the hub and spoke model, you have to ensure that your right leaders and the core of your team is sitting
Correct.
and working out of these emerging hubs, so that more and more people are attracted there and they don't have this fear of obsolescence. But how do you see, what are the role of a government, corporate, and a body like Nasscom to further this cause and bring up emerging hubs?
Yeah, so I think, Anish, I've seen more talk about emerging hubs in the last 1 year than I've seen for the cumulative last 30 years, right? And that's primarily because if you look at any state government agenda today, especially, when they have these large summits where they talk about investments into the state, the establishment of GCCs and specifically establishment of them in tier 2 locations is a big part of the agenda. So I think one of the first thing is really happening, which is the fact that you and I are even having a conversation about it, is because the word is starting to spread. And I think this is one important aspect, and especially for communities like the Nasscom community, etc., is to start spreading the word out that, hey, look, there are 5 options for you in terms of tier 2 locations. And here's what's happened there. Here's the kind of infrastructure investments being made or government investments being made. So at least people start to understand. And we are doing our part as well. We've been working with the ministries of different states as well as central government to further this cause, right? So education is one big part of this exercise. The second part of the exercise, to your point, I think if you look at GCCs and what they would appreciate in a policy, I think a lot of times people mistake the fact that fiscal incentives should form the primary objective of a policy. That, to be honest, is not as attractive to GCCs and companies that establish GCCs. What is much more attractive is any kind of skilling initiatives, talent acquisition, easing of the talent acquisition, the ability to run your business easily, right? So less red tapeism, stability in that region. These are factors that are a big part of the choice of a region, right? Will I have access to grade A infrastructure? Will I have uninterrupted power? Can I establish a lab and be able to procure equipment and bring it into that city? Will I not have issues from a geopolitical perspective? These are factors that go a long way to a company actually choosing a city, as opposed to will I get 35% off my electricity bill for the first 2 years, etc. Really doesn't matter, especially when you're establishing a satellite hub. You've already come into the country, you know how the country operates, you know what your operating costs are. So I think that's the second part, is more and more policies should integrate some of these things and make that the cornerstone rather than running after, let me roll out 15 different initiatives and people will jump in. They will not, right? So once that starts to become more mainstream, I feel in the next 2 to 3 years, you will start to see companies look at these cities. Because let's be honest, Anish, the major hubs are exploding. If you look at a Bangalore today, oversaturated and at its brim, right? We all know that. A Hyderabad is constantly upgrading infrastructure because it also knows at some point it is going to run out of resources. Pune, to some degree, is saturated. Chennai, probably not so much, but it's a large city in itself. Gurgaon, it's quite saturated as well. And what's happening with that is just driving up costs of operations. Because while we only look at cost arbitrage and salaries, people are sometimes not aware that real estate costs and facilities and general ecosystem costs also form 30 to 35% of a GCC operation. When that real estate cost is going to start going through the roof, especially in major established locations, it's going to start hitting the bottom line, right? These factors will eventually drive people to find alternatives, and some people already have. So I think, to me, the start has been good in terms of getting people aware that these cities are now ready to do business. The next step is actually to get people to be convinced to move to that location, right? Yeah. And that's going to take some doing.
Yeah, it won't be a short journey. It's a long journey ahead.
Correct.
And I think we all share a collective responsibility, and we all need to play our own respective roles. Like you rightly said, the government should think beyond the fiscal incentives. The corporate should be more open to explore and, at least start in that hub and spoke model, or explore the possibilities with the rise of the mid-market GCCs. And bodies like Nasscom and others are obviously responsible for creating more awareness, making sure that the world is aware in a much greater way about the possibilities, the art of possible from these emerging hubs.
Absolutely.
So I would have loved to, continue this conversation, because we were discussing very important things. But given the time restriction, if I have to ask you one last question and we'll conclude, what is, how do you see the future of emerging hubs? Say we all are talking about next 5 years being the very critical to the GCC growth. So if two things that we have to really do well, what would be those two?
Yeah, so I think, look, I think they will have an important role to play. We should continue to invest into these hubs from a connectivity standpoint, from an infrastructure standpoint. And beyond that, from a talent standpoint, so which basically means there are certain hubs today, especially on the emerging hub side, which have access and are in close proximity to some very, very good institutions of learning, right? They need to also have a role to play in this, because that's the kind of talent that people want. They right out of school. Maybe it's service providers that go there first, or even GCCs, right? So I think the educational institutions also have a large role to play. But beyond all of this, I think what will be interesting and what you will see, because that demographic is showing up, beyond the age of 35, once you've gone past that initial, as you were pointing out, initial attraction to move to a tier 1 location, there are many, many people today who would prefer to go back to an emerging hub. Cost of living is lower, far more stable. You're close to your family. You don't need to worry about some of the basic things, because all of these emerging hubs. I think somewhere in this journey, it has to be made attractive to them that, hey, look, you have an option, work in Bangalore or work in Indore or whatever it is. Make a choice. We'll open a satellite center. Let's move there, right? So I see a push towards satellite centers far more than primary hubs. Okay. But I think it's going to take another couple of years before you actually start seeing that number north of that 7-8%.
Perfect. No, so in summary, I'll say invest in talent and invest in increasing the attractiveness, and not just by the fiscal attractiveness, but more in terms of the quality of life these emerging hubs may offer to the tech world. Thank you so much, Arindam, for your time and inputs,
My pleasure.
sharing your candid views. I'm looking forward to another day and another conversation like this. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, and thank you for having me.